welcome back for another episode of the Warm Up Podcast. Today, I am so lucky to be here with Parker McMullen Bushman. She is also known as Kween Werk, and she is the outspoken social media, environmental, and social justice advocate that you can find on TikTok, Instagram, and just all over the place. I've been following Parker personally for quite a few years now, and just seeing her work and her passion for this has been something that's really instilled a passion for me too, of learning more and asking questions and getting more involved in different communities, and really paving the way for me of like how I can think differently and challenge myself too. So Parker, I am so thankful that I get to share some time with you, because I know that you are very busy and have lots of things that you're juggling and on your plate. So I would love for you just to take a moment and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. I'm Parker, and you gave a lot in your introduction. But I like to tell people, I like to say I wear a number of different head wraps.
Yes.
I am the CEO of Eco Inclusive Strategies, which is a consulting org around DEI issues in the conservation space. I work mostly with conservation based, environmental based orgs. I also work with nonprofits and museums and interpretive sites. In addition to that, I am the COO of Inclusive Guide. Inclusive Guide is a tech startup. If anyone,
Amazing.
sorry, I shouldn't have said it with a question mark. It's a tech startup. If anyone had asked me though, like 10 years ago, if I'd be like the CEO of a tech startup, I would have told them they had the wrong person. But the guy is, I think, such important work. And basically, we've got a website that's like Yelp, but for inclusion. And so people can rate their experiences
Mm.
in places, spaces, outdoor spaces, nature centers, or like even in businesses, for how they feel in relation to their
Mm.
identity. Did they feel safe? Did they feel welcome? Did they feel celebrated and able to be their full authentic selves in those spaces? And then we provide businesses with feedback on which populations they're serving well and which maybe they need some more support serving. And then I'm also on social media as Kween Werk, which has a unique spelling, KWEENWERK, where I talk about all of this stuff and my work and my experiences being outdoors, as well as
Yes.
trying to provide representation as a fat Black woman in this space.
So what Parker's really saying is that she's a powerhouse and she does all the things and she is like, yeah, you are just making and paving a way for different voices and communities to have a space and to have a voice and to have a platform. And it is incredible the work that you do. And yeah, just being able to follow along, I'm like, oh my gosh, like you just don't stop and you are growing and doing more and more and more, and just coming up with all of these incredible avenues to advocate and to make sure that everyone has a space and everyone gets their voices heard, and really holding everybody accountable for, making sure that these spaces are safe and inclusive and that people are thinking about equity. So yeah, I'm just so excited to have this conversation with you, and for everybody listening to hear about what you're doing and also go and support it after this. So yeah, thank you so much for coming. And I want to start way back when and just have you tell us a little bit about, yeah, like your beginning and growing up, what your relationship was with the outdoors, and like how did you interact with nature from a young age?
Yeah, sure. It's so interesting because my answer to this question has actually changed over
Mm.
time. Like I've been in the environmental education field for almost 25 years.
Yeah.
And when I first started out and people would ask me like, how did you get connected to nature? What was your background? Like I would always say, oh, I've never been really outdoorsy. My family wasn't outdoorsy,
Mm.
I don't know. I didn't really, we weren't, I never went to a national park when I was a kid. I
Yeah.
never went camping. And so I thought that those things meant that I was outdoorsy, but
Mm,
was not outdoorsy because I didn't do those things. But actually, as I have um, done my work around social justice and kind of learned about connection to the outdoors, I realized that that was not true, and that
yeah.
that was actually a disservice to my community and my ancestors and
Mm,
all of these things. So I grew up in the Bronx, right? Once again, not
yeah.
a space that we would say is um, like, oh, that's a really natural space. But I spent a lot of time in connection with my community, my neighborhood, and the nature in my community. My parents were both from the South, had moved to New York and met each other and decided to have a family. And they took us outside. We did spend time in parks. We spent time
Yeah.
climbing trees. We spent time walking the city blocks. And, even though you don't typically think of those spaces as being like super nature, like urban nature is there and it's
Yeah.
important and it needs to be recognized. And I did get connection. Like I loved trees. I loved playing outside. I loved, my mom was notorious for uh, throwing down a picnic blanket wherever there was a patch of green
Yeah.
grass, even if it was like in the middle of like a busy area. We were going to have a picnic. And I also spent a lot of time walking with my dad, doing things like collecting aluminum cans.
Mm,
My dad would collect them to turn them in for money, right?
yeah. Yeah.
So for a long time I didn't think of that as being anything special, but my dad was recycling, right?
Yeah.
And he was helping the environment, but we don't necessarily give um credence to activities that are done out of necessity
Yeah.
rather than out of just because. And we did a lot of reducing, reusing, and recycling activities um, out of necessity. And so like my first lessons about conservation, about connection to my local environment, about care for my local environment, really developed on those city streets in the Bronx.
Mm,
And I cared so much for that environment that I actually started to ask my parents about how we could do more to like
mm.
pick up the trash. Like we were picking up aluminum cans, but what about the trash we were leaving behind? Um, and my mom, she said, I don't know what we should do. Maybe you should write a letter to the New York Times. And I actually did at 9 years old. I
Amazing.
like typed this letter up to multiple newspapers, and my parents drove me around. And that was back when we didn't have computers, we had typewriters.
Yeah.
So I typed it up and drove it around, and it was really passionate. I was like, dear people, we are ruining our planet, right? We're throwing trash into oceans, beaches, and more. Like I had this like idea about saving the planet, even though I had never had an environmental education class, even though
Mm,
no one taught me officially what conservation was or officially what recycling was, right? I still developed a real care for my environment and the nature around me because my parents took me outside and my parents connected me to that. So now I don't say that I didn't grow up outdoorsy, right? Because I definitely did. I just had a
really.
different experience than what we typically speak of when we talk about people being in outdoor spaces.
Yeah, I think that's so important too, to make sure that everybody knows that experiencing the outdoors isn't just like summiting a mountain or climbing a really tough route on the side of a canyon or something. It is like gardening. It is going to your local farmers market. It is taking walks in the park. It's putting your feet in grass. It's walking blocks and paying attention to trees and plants and the insects that are there. Like it's so many different ways instead of just like these extreme versions of what outdoor focuses look like. And I think that there should be a shift to know that like different communities experience the outdoors in different ways, and like all of it is advocating and loving nature, not just these very, everybody has to have the perfect gear and like lots of gear and very expensive things and going camping and having all of this stuff. Like that's not the only way to experience nature. And all of these things mean you're outdoorsy.
Exactly. I think it's so true and such an important conversation
Mhm.
because we talk about wanting to bring communities into this environmental conversation. We know we've got issues, yet
Yeah.
we are shoving a lot of communities out, like my uncle rode his bike to work like 20-30 miles a day because he didn't have
Wow.
a car, right? But no one told him he was like lowering carbon emissions or that he was helping the planet, right? People thought poorly of him because he
Mm,
didn't have a car, because not having a car, out of necessity is not looked at the same way as if, oh, I can afford a car. I
yeah.
have a car, but I choose to ride my bike because I'm helping the environment, right? My
Yeah.
grandmother had that as well. My grandmother worked really hard. She washed her clothes by hand. She put them
Mm,
out on the line. She had a garden. She, if you talk about reuse, she would reuse all of her Cool Whip containers to be
yeah.
Tupperware, and there's like she did the actions, but we didn't have that conversation, and no one would think of those as environmental actions, but they definitely are. We have to kind of widen that discussion so that people understand, oh, the things that I'm doing, are actually helping. And no, I don't have to, like the big thing is like, oh, all of my waste for the year fit into a
Yeah.
mayonnaise jar,
Yeah.
right? Which is an admirable goal, but that takes a lot of money to
Yes.
buy the resources that you can reuse again and again, and it takes time to be able to shop in that way. And we want, I hope for a day where everyone has the resources and time to be able to do things like that. But
Yeah.
we also need to celebrate and lift up and highlight the ways that people who have less money, less support, are still doing actions that are helpful so that they can see themselves in this conversation and perhaps want to do even more.
It's so true, especially like these are sustainable actions without people realizing that they are sustainable actions because they feel like, well, because I have to do it, it's no longer this thing. And it's like, no, this is helping the environment. You are being eco-minded just by the fact that you're doing these things, even though I feel like that's a very interesting conversation I like almost want to stick with for a little bit about, the fact that like because I have the means to shop this way and make that decision, now I'm being eco-friendly. But if I had to do this for survival, it's looked down on instead of something that's celebrated. And that's just so interesting. So I'm like, oh, same with like van life, like if I had to live in my car, that would be looked at completely different than, well, I'm choosing to purchase a car
Yep.
that I'm going to like camp in and live in. Like this is a very different lifestyle that I'm choosing, so it's okay. And like what is that perception and why do we have that perception instead of being like, yeah, championing these decisions where it's like, you know what, you're doing this and it's amazing that you're making these decisions and you're choosing to spend your time this way, or like you're walking to the grocery store instead of having a car to go 2 blocks.
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts? Like, why is that? Why do we have this view? Like, why do we have these very big shifts in perspective based on who it is that's doing it?
Yeah, I think um, when we look at our society as a whole, we have to be aware of the different systems that we're
Yeah.
operating within. And as a country, we've been having a lot of conversation around social issues,
Hmm.
and also having conversations around how we got to these social issues.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of bias built into it, right? And bias isn't only, there's not only racial bias and sexuality bias or gender bias,
Hmm.
but there's also bias around class.
Yeah.
And classism is a big thing. And we um, have like a narrative as a country that people who have money, they worked really hard to get it. They're deserving of
Mhm.
it. And if you don't have money, you didn't work hard enough. You don't want it enough.
Mhm.
And, you know, you are, or maybe you're undeserving of it. And we think of people and plants and animals and places as all commodities
Yeah.
in this kind of system to be used, you know, and um, to amass more profits, which is also, you know, that's a bigger conversation
Yes.
around where we have been with COVID. Like COVID was a big uh, kind of wake up call for us as a country,
Yes.
because people that we depend on for base services, right, were being exposed
Yeah.
to sickness and bringing that back home. And we realized that, oh, these like, if people go to work sick, which is like a badge of honor, you know, used to be a badge of honor.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm sick, but I care so much about my job that I'm here today to do my work and spread this sickness,
Yes.
right? Like it's really complex when we think about how we think about people and wealth and
Hmm.
society. And so when someone is doing something out of necessity, right, we just don't think of it the same way, because we have that bias around what their motives are and what it means for them as a person, right? We have certain cultural biases against
Yeah.
people who are in lower socioeconomic brackets. We think of them as not being as intelligent, not
Mhm.
being as worthy to be able to make decisions for their lives. They're, you know, they're not well educated, so we need
Mhm.
to make the decisions for them. And all of that is tied into that narrative, right? So
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to be able to stick with this for a little bit longer for anyone who's listening, and maybe this is their first kind of introduction to the conversation of environmental injustices and how that ties in with racial and class injustices and any kind of biases that we're going to talk about. And how important it is to acknowledge these things and the differences and like how backwards it is to have this kind of double standard when we're talking about something like this, and how glaringly obvious it is when we're starting to talk about these things. Like, oh, if I choose to recycle my cans, that's like something people are going to clap about. But if someone's out picking up cans on the street and that's something that they need to go trade that in for money, that's no longer something to be clapped about or celebrated, and how backwards that is and how we need to shift the way that we're thinking. And like you said, you know, like how we need to include everybody in these conversations to welcome them in and say, hey, you're doing your part, you're doing something important here. And to like have spaces at the table for these conversations to happen and for those upliftings of communities to be happening. So I really appreciate you bringing that up and talking about that, because it's so important to shine a light on and to sit and think about for a minute. And like, yeah, what we can be doing to allow that space, allow those conversations, to welcome those kinds of spaces for everybody to be a part of this and to be a part of a movement to care for outdoor spaces and nature and one another. And I wanted to touch too, because obviously you're so informed, you know so much, you're so passionate about it. And this kind of loops back to where we were. But, how did you get into this work? Like, what led you on this path from being a steward at a young age and writing to newspapers and advocating for change? And now here you are. So, like, what has that looked like over the years? Because you've said you've worked in the conservation space for over 20 years. So, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so when I was younger, I didn't even know that this was a career,
Mm.
right? I didn't understand that this was available. I went to my undergrad I started off pre-med, like
Oh,
from the
wow.
time
Okay.
I was in third grade until like my first year of college, I was going to be a brain surgeon. I just knew it.
Whoa.
And because like I had a teacher one day talked about their kid that was a brain surgeon, and I could see the reaction, and I was like, oh,
Mm.
that's what I'm gonna be. And then I got into like my first year of college and took like my math classes, and I was like, oh. mm, maybe not. And so I shifted to anthropology,
Okay.
uh, sociology, which was interesting. I was like, I like people. I think I'd like
Mm.
to study people. Um, but I got out of college. There were no jobs for Indiana Jones. And so, I was trying to figure out what I should do. And I had, I had been involved, I'd gone to summer camp. So, something that I hadn't talked about yet is my family eventually moved from the Bronx to South Georgia,
Okay.
which was a big shift as I was coming out of middle school.
Okay.
And I, in the South, I got involved with 4-H, which was really interesting and really different for me. Getting involved in the 4-H program, and I went to summer camp
Okay.
um, during that time, and my summer camp
Mm.
experience was really interesting. It was really different. Um, to me, and I had a different expectation than everyone else. Um, but because I had gone to summer camp,
Yeah.
I knew some people in that realm, and someone told me that, oh, well, there's not just summer camps, there's also year round camp that is environmental education. So when I got done with school, I was like, oh, maybe I'll try one of these
Yeah.
environmental education jobs, right? While I'm trying to figure out my life, and I went into it.
Yeah.
My qualification just being that I had a college degree, and you know that really opened my world to a whole
Yeah.
different, like there's a whole community there, there's a whole career there. But it took me a while to understand, and I was doing that work for a little while. Like there were a few years where I was like, oh, okay, when am I going to go be an adult and like go work at a real job? And at some point I kind of looked around after having worked years. I had gotten uh, married and dragged my significant other along with me too to work these jobs, and I was like, oh, okay, is this my career? Like, is this what I'm doing? So,
Mm.
I went from not knowing that it existed to thinking, oh, like maybe this is where I need to be. And then I had some
Mm.
people telling me that, yes, this is where you need to be. And, um, there's a career here for you. Um, and I actually, it took me a while to be convinced of that I could have a long term career in conservation and environmental
Mm.
education, because I didn't see a whole lot of people that looked like me. And I had a mentor at one point. He's
Mm.
wonderful, but was an older white male, and we had a phone call like once a month, and we'd talk about what was going on. Or sometimes I would like call him just when I couldn't like understand things, because that's another thing. You go into a new career, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
learning, but there's also a culture that's set up there. So a lot of the people that I worked with had been camping, out over tent camping their whole life, had been to national parks, had had these experiences that solidified
Mm.
them as a group that I had not had. And I, needed, sometimes I would call him and ask him questions just about things that I was hearing, things that people were talking about statements, right? That folks would say in
Mm.
meetings. And he really helped me along. And, he was director of a site. And I was like, that's what I want to do. But I just don't think that like anyone is going to like. I think that when people think about who is our next director going to be, they're looking for someone that looked like my mentor, right? And they weren't looking for someone that looked like me. But he convinced me that I needed to stick with it, and that there would be a
Yeah,
place for me in this. And so I did
that's
stick with
amazing. I
it,
wanted to
and
ask too if
here
you
I
would
am.
share any like what your experience like what was it like to be in that space when you're like there aren't people that look like me, like what is that, what is that like to want to move into a position or like wanting to grow in a role and being like, well, I don't know if this is for me, and to share with people like what that experience is like, because I also, this kind of segues into something else too, where like I want you to share about like your experience on trails and like when you do go out, like what it's like to be a Black female who is out there like owning space and the experiences you have, because that is a big part of what you share on social media is like your interactions and experiences when you are outdoors and the things that are said to you or the challenges that you face. So I just want to give some space for you to share like what that is like to walk into a space and be like, well, I don't know if this is actually meant for me, and how that shifts, you know, like if you
Yeah.
hadn't had your mentor to say like you should keep going, like you would have, it sounds like you would have been discouraged to not even try to pursue it because of that.
Yeah, it was interesting. At a lot of the spaces that I worked, um, I was either the only
Mhm.
or one of a very few people of color. And then when we talked about the education place, often the only. And so I started out my career at
Okay.
residential environmental learning centers, which are basically like people would come, stay overnight. We'd take them into the local ecosystems. We'd teach them about the ecosystem. Often it was school groups, sometimes it was adult groups, right? Or college courses, coming to learn about. And I spent the the majority of
Okay.
my career in coastal and marine sites and centers. And so the people who worked there, when we talk about folks of color, they
Okay.
were mostly in service positions. Um, and I was
Mm.
I was often thought to be in those positions as well, because there weren't ever any people in the education realm. I faced, microaggressions all the time from either people that I worked with or people who came to the site. So, like, an example would be I had a boss who once called her, or not once, it was multiple times, called her dog that only barked
Oh
at black
man.
people, her little KKK dog. And I kind of like stuffed that down. And what else is really interesting is that when you are,
Yeah.
we talk about like bias, and we talk about the way that it shows up, right? And then there's also a protection of the systems and the places. And when you are within the system, you feel the need to protect the system sometimes. And so, like, I remember having my very first colleague of color, a black man, come in while I was working at this same site that I just mentioned. And when the director made that comment in front of him, he was
Yeah.
from, Philadelphia, and he was appalled. He was like, "What? Like, this is not." And he came to me, and I'd been working in the South for a few years by that time. And so he came to me and he's like, "I can't believe she said that." And my response was to kind of tell him, "Well, it's the South and blah blah blah." And like, I look back at that and think about, one, the way
Yeah.
that I was protecting my boss, and but then also the way that I felt so worried. I was like, "Oh, if he says anything, like, will he get in trouble? Will he lose his job, or will
Mm.
they like label him as a troublemaker, or whatever?" And so it's really complex when you are working within these organizations. And it's not just people of color, it's like people who have
Yeah.
identities that don't
Yeah.
fit into the majority identity, right? And so, as I like worked in these spaces, I was often, either in big ways or little ways, received feedback through microaggressions that I was not
Mm.
expected, that I was not the norm, right? Whether that was like, I would lead these kayaking trips and people would show up.
Yeah.
I would be the only one there with all the boats. And people would come up to me and they would kind of look around and they'd be like, "Oh, so who's leading our kayaking trip today?" Right? So, like,
Yeah.
just an assumption that it would not be me. When I worked in other spaces, like I said earlier, I was always assumed to be housekeeping or working in the kitchen. Um, Even when I rose to a director level, I still received those comments where people are like, "We really loved your bacon this morning." Or I'd be like setting up for an evening presentation, and folks would come in who hadn't met me yet, and they'd be like, "Oh, they got you working so late cleaning up. I thought that housekeeping would be gone by now." And so I lived in this kind of weird in between place where, as I taught the education, I was
Mm.
told all the time that I was not accepted and not the norm. And then to seek solace and to kind of be around people that I felt connected with, like, I would spend hours sitting in the back room of the kitchen, just talking to the women in the kitchen, because they reminded
Yeah.
me of my mother and my grandmother and these people in my community. And so I felt like I was in this kind of weird in between place
Yeah.
that is not it's not really comfortable. And um to not feel wholly like you're accepted is just
Yeah. Has
not
that
a
changed over
comfortable
time as
place to
you've kind of
be.
grown in your career and things have, I mean, I'm hoping that as I would say, even in the past 5 years, that we're seeing a shift in conversation and awareness and mindfulness and intention. There's more conversations happening. There's more advocacy happening, I think. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. But, like, do you feel like there is a shift? Do you feel more comfortable in these spaces? Is there more representation happening? Like, from your perspective, do you feel a difference?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think there's kind of two sides to that question. I personally am feeling more comfortable in those spaces, but I think that comfort
Yeah.
comes with a level of being known and a level of the power that I've generated around myself, right? I chose to um I was in working in organizations and really trying to do
Yeah.
work to advance DEI within those organizations. But there were still a lot of issues. And
Yeah.
once I stepped out on my own, right, then that's where I really kind of felt like I blossomed and was able to kind of grow the work that I
Yeah.
do. And why is that? Why could that not be within an organization, right? Why
Own
did it have to
space.
be
Yeah.
like creating a whole nother organization on my own? And I feel like I have, lots of friends that are still kind of in working within organizations and face their own things, their own uh, experiences that kind of wear on them. I think that there is more conversation, yes. And I think that organizations and places are progressing and are really kind of starting to see that this is important work. But I think that the base understanding of how we got
Yeah.
to where we are and how to make change is varies from
Yeah.
organization and can be difficult, right, for people to understand. And I've like seen it where organizations they're like, we
Yeah.
want to do the work, we really want diversity, right? They're focused on diversity, but
Yeah.
that's not really where their beginning focus should be. Like when we talk about making changes within organizations, we want to get to the diversity first because it's our way to
Mm.
gauge that we have a successful effort, right? There are, we haven't set up a lot of ways to gauge if our diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice efforts are working. And having more people of diverse backgrounds is like, okay,
Yeah.
we know, like, that's something we can point to. But really, organizations should be working on inclusion and equity first, before bringing in the diversity, because a lot of times they bring in the diversity and those people experience harm, right? And then they
Yeah.
leave the organization, and the organization is like, why did this happen? And we look at Diverse Green. I always, if folks are listening, you should check out diversegreen.org. It is a research, a site that does a lot of research around diversity in conservation
Yeah.
groups. They created the Green 2.0 project, and they have some really great research. They do these transparency report cards for the industry, and they also like one of their reports
Okay.
was I think called Leaking Talent, and it was about why folks of color are leaving
Mm.
organizations. Like, why are they not staying? What are some of the things that they are going through? They've also done Beyond Diversity and Diversity Derailed, and a lot of it is because people are not focused on the organizational and institutional change that has to happen before we can successfully bring people in. Like, the reason why our organizations look the way that they do
Yeah.
isn't uh, like a mistake, right? A lot of the things were designed that way. And when I try to talk to people about that, what I say is, like, we all design when we have to do a project or we have to
Yeah.
build something, we often design things that are comfortable for us, right? And that isn't like a malicious thing, but we're like, what would I like? What do I think is needed for being successful? And when we think about, we can go back, to the beginning of our country and say, who was there at the beginning. Well, at the time, folks that were in power
Yeah.
were white males, and not only white males, but wealthy land owning white males. Women
Yeah.
were not allowed to work, we're not allowed to own property, right? And a lot of those things were built into how our laws were created, how our country was developed, the norms of our society. Black people were property at that point, right? That was also built into a lot of our laws, the way that we acted as a society. We've got lots of those things. And those folks at the time, right, were really thinking about what is a space that's comfortable for when we say like one nation, for all men, right? Who were we really talking about at that time? And
Right.
that was the seed, and everything's kind of grown out from there, and we still have a legacy left over from that initial thing. And when we think about, okay, conservation and environmentalism, right? That's the same thing. Who was at the beginning, and
Yeah.
like how were spaces created with them in
Right.
mind? And when we say like having privilege, right? That is just
In mind.
having
Yeah.
a place created with you in mind. Um, yeah, I was talking about uh, a speech that I had given a few months ago, and when I went into the facility, I was upstairs in a room, and there were only stairs to get up to that space, right? And that building, I would guess, was
Right.
probably designed by an able bodied architect, right? The people who use that space are all able bodied people. And not a whole lot of thought had been given to like, what if someone was a wheelchair user? What if someone used large mobility
Right.
equipment? Like, how would they navigate this space? And so I had privilege in that space as an able-bodied person, because that
Right.
space was designed with someone like me in mind. It was designed by someone who shared my attributes of being able-bodied, and it worked well for other people who were able-bodied. And when we think about our organizations, right, who was there at the beginning, who was it designed for, and who does it work really well
Yeah.
for? And we have to like have that conversation and say, well, what are the things that we need to change so that when other people come who it wasn't originally designed for, they can feel
Yeah,
comfortable
that's so
in this
important to shed
space
light on too.
as
And I feel like
well.
that was the best way to introduce this concept. And like when people are trying to say, well, the outdoors is for everyone, or like, it is for everyone. It's like, no, like you said, like historically, the way this was set up, it wasn't for everyone. It was for a specific set of people that were in the framework of how these people envisioned those spaces to be. And I think that's really important in the way you broke it down is like really attainable and like very digestible for people to understand what we mean when we say that there are systems in place and that those systems are working for and against different people and different communities.
Yeah, when I go into like people like will say sometimes say things to me like, "Oh, well, like were you trying to say the trees are racist?" Like like there's well, like what do you mean?
The outdoor
And
industry,
no,
I
right?
should say.
The outdoors, like if the
Yes.
outdoors
Yes.
was
Yes.
unmanaged, right? And maybe it could
Yes.
be for everyone, but people manage those spaces, people use those spaces. And when I go into those spaces, I am definitely not what folks expect. Like, I get asked a lot of times, I can't tell you how many times I get asked, is it my first hike? Like a lot of times, like, is this your first hike? Do you know where you're going? Do you know what you're doing? Like, or sometimes people just come up to me on the trail and they're like, whoa, you're colorful, and then they walk away, right? Which is like a
Yeah.
statement of, whoa, you are different in this space. Like sometimes
Yeah.
people are like, oh, but that's a compliment. And I'm like, no, that's not a compliment.
Yes.
Like, hey, I really like your colorful head wrap, would be a
Like, you don't
compliment.
belong here. I didn't
Whoa,
expect to
you're
see something like
colorful.
this here.
Like, it's
Yeah.
not a
Yeah.
compliment. And right? Yeah. And if I turned it around, like if I said, "Whoa, you're
Offensive.
monotone,"
I don't like
like
that.
suddenly people start to understand, oh,
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
maybe that's not a compliment. I really like the way all your colors are
Yeah, it
so
doesn't work like
drab.
that. I feel like this is a perfect segue too into Kween Werk and kind of like what you're doing with your platform in that way. And I have like some questions around like obviously I follow you and you bring up so many different points. So anybody listening, if you want to learn more and just like learn more about different experiences outdoors, go follow her. I mean, follow her for all the reasons, but you post a lot of the comments you get, the questions you get, and like your responses, and it's just really eye opening of how many different comments, like the audacity people have to say things to you and that they feel like they have the right to say things to you or ask you certain things that like there's just no business like asking certain things or saying these comments to you, but they just feel like they have the right to do that. So I'd love for you just to tell everyone what Kween Werk stands for, and then I have some follow-up questions after that.
Yeah. So yeah, Queen Work is my social platforms. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Queen is actually spelled Kween, and then work is Werk. And Queen Kween is keep
Mm-hmm.
widening environmental engagement narratives. And the idea for my platform is to like kind of widen that discussion around who is in the outdoors, who likes the outdoors, who uses the
Yeah.
outdoors, who what an outdoorsy person is, right? Because I love getting outdoors, but I love bright colors, I love lipstick, I love funky glasses and
Yeah.
earrings, and I don't feel the need to change that about myself to go into outdoor spaces. I'm a Black woman. I am a fat woman. And some days, I use she,
Mm-hmm.
they pronouns. Some days I feel like a non binary person, and that gender doesn't have anything to do with my experiences in the world or how I feel like I am as a person. And I feel like all of those things, all of those conversations, right, are important for me to bring into outdoor spaces, but they're not the stories and the conversations that are typically
Yes,
held.
yeah,
So
and I
I
feel
think it's
like
important to
so much
provide
of
that
your
representation.
platform is to support, uplift, and give representation to all these different groups and communities, and the shed light on the biases that you experience or you have conversations with people and they are experiencing. And I would love to know about just some of the kinds of comments that you face outdoors, or like the biases that you hear when you go out, because you are so yourself and you just show up and you're like, well, this is me and I'm going to be out here and I'm going to take up space and I'm going to do these things because I love them. But I mean, I've read some of the comments that have been said to you, like, do you actually think you can make it up this mountain, and all of these things. And I'm like the gall on people, because I know that I also get outdoors and someone wouldn't say that to me. I have other comments that are made to me about being a female or things like that, but it's just like what gives people the right to say these things? So I would love to just shed light on some of the conversations, comments, and things that you've experienced outdoors to give people insight into not everybody's experience outside is the same. And I think that when we hear these comments like, well, the outdoors is for everyone, it's like, well, these experiences show us that that's not true. It's not safe and it doesn't feel good for everyone. So I would just love to give you that space to share some of the experiences you've had.
It's so interesting because I feel like there's a range, right? And sometimes people are like genuinely curious and don't
Yeah.
understand and don't realize that they're perpetrating a microaggression because like it's not something they would say to other people.
Hmm.
And then sometimes there are really hostile things. So I think a lot of times when people comment, and they see me in the outdoors, it's around my ability as a fat person, or whether as
Mm,
a Black person, like I know what I'm doing, right? Like I think they just assume that Black people aren't out there often, and so they just maybe don't know, or they need some extra help. I think sometimes there are also weird things that happen. Like I went outdoors with a friend who was a photographer, and we were on one part of the trail and kind of went to go take pictures
mm,
on another part of the trail. And I told her, you should bring your backpack with you, because she had laid it down to get her camera out. And she was like, oh, we're just going around the corner. It'll be okay.
oh no.
When we came back around, sure enough, her backpack was gone. Right. And so we are like, okay, let's go up to the ranger office to see about it. And so we went up there, asked if a backpack had been turned in, gave very, like, we couldn't see the pack. We gave very specific identity information about the pack. Um, and they went to the back. They found the pack right away. It had been turned in. But then they wanted to like grill
Mm-hmm.
us more, and I'm Black, my friend's Latina, more about well, if it was really our pack, and if there was their identification in the pack, could we name the ID? Could we name the contents of the pack? Um, and it was really interesting because we kind of went through the experience like, oh, okay, like let's bend over
Yeah.
backwards to try and prove that this property belongs to us. And then we're telling the story later, um, to a friend who was white, who had actually had a similar experience, where they had put their stuff down and came back, and when someone was a good Samaritan and took it to the
Just hand it
office,
right back.
and they got asked no questions, right? They were like, oh, I came because I'm missing. I lost something on the trail. Do you have a lost and found? And they're like, oh, actually, yeah, this just
Yeah.
got turned in. Is this yours? Oh, here you go, right? And so it's just interesting because the perceptions, how we perceive people, whether that's in an urban
Yeah.
environment or a natural environment, is similar, right? People bring those perceptions to the environment. I also have people like on my social media channels will comment things about, the fact that I wore lipstick on a hike, or have said things like, oh, her glasses and lipstick make me hate nature. Um, I've had
Yeah.
friends, and this isn't only like experiences that I have. Like I have a friend that works with youth of color. Oftentimes, when she takes her group or their groups into um, the spaces, they're told, "Oh, I come up here to get away from folks like this. Why would you bring them up?" So there's like this point of view about who belongs in these spaces, who does not belong, and who's prepared, who's not prepared, what is the
Yeah.
right way to look when you're using the outdoors, what's the wrong way to look, like all of these things. And
And
then
when
they
that
come
stuff
out in
happens, like when
little
you have
ways through
comments made to you, or like,
interactions.
your friend with her group, like, how does that make you feel? What does that make you want to do? Like, I'm sure for you, because of the fact that you are such an advocate, you are very strong, and I feel like you are probably just like, well, this makes me want to take up more space. I want to be here. I'm going to be the person to lead. But, like what does that feel like to have that set? I mean, it can't feel safe. It can't feel welcoming.
Yeah, it doesn't really feel
Mhm.
welcoming, but I do come to it and I keep with it. And some days I get really good experiences, and some days I don't. What I am worried, like, I feel like I have built up enough of understanding of the spaces and the people and what I can, how I can present myself in those spaces, that I kind of just am like, well, I'm here and this is what I'm doing. But
Yeah.
I worry about folks who are coming to it for the first time, people who are fairly new, right? Because it's not also like, if you think about
Yep.
where you have to go to get to these, a lot of these spaces, right? There are different personalities of different communities, and not everyone feels safe in those places. And if they're starting off new and they have an experience, it can be, really, really difficult. I said I was working with an organization and staying in a pretty rural town in Colorado. I had to stay overnight there twice. And I was really excited about my stay. It was a place
Yeah.
where people go to get outdoors, right? They had lots of outdoor activities, lots of like guiding companies and all of these things. And the first time I stayed in a tiny
Yeah.
house. And I went there, I was like, this is great. I can't wait. It was, they had 5 tiny houses in a trailer park area. Mine was right across from the main office, but I had trouble finding mine because it was not marked.
Okay.
It was marked on the map, but not marked on the building. And so I got out and like looking around. I turn around and there's a gentleman standing behind me. He was like, "What are you doing here?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm looking for my tiny house." And he kind of just grunted and walked away. I ended up calling the place where I made the reservation, and they guided me to figure out, like, I was standing right in front of the place. They were like, "Oh, you should be right in front of the main office, and so runs the main office. They can help you with
No.
anything you need." Well, that was so and so.
Yeah.
Like,
It
that
makes you
was
feel safe.
the
Yeah.
person, and they were not helpful. They knew why I was there. They said, "What are you doing here?" And then walked away. And so I said, okay, my second time, maybe I need to stay at a hotel and not stay at a place that
Hmm.
is, privately owned or whatever. And so I got to the hotel the second time, and there were the person who was checking me in, and then 2 other men behind the front desk, that they lived there. So
Okay.
their family did the maintenance for the space. So they lived there, but I don't think that they worked there. And when I came in, one of the gentlemen felt the need to tell me a story about his friend that he had in childhood who was black, who, and then like announced to the whole lobby that he had gotten his black card because he was friends with this person. And the thing that you needed to know about having your black card is that you need to know the
Oh.
difference between saying the N word with the A on the end or with the ER on the end. But he was saying it the whole time. And then, I kind of got my room key and I was like, okay, thanks, I'm going to go to my room. And he followed me. He followed me to my room to continue telling me this story about, all the ways that he was comfortable using the N word while saying the N word to me as he followed me to my room, right? And so, like, you get these experiences and you're like, I
Yeah.
don't feel like this is a place that I feel safe, that I feel,
Do you feel like you
welcomed
can
or
say anything at
celebrated,
that point
right?
either? Like,
Like,
do you
I
feel
need
like
to
you
be
have
elsewhere.
the ability to say like you can't say that, or to like, and I guess it's kind of, yeah, yeah,
Not in that
yeah,
space, not in a rural area where I'm
your
by
room.
myself. And now this person has followed me to my room. They know what room I'm in. Like, I just did not feel comfortable about the whole thing, which is another really awful situation that I think a lot of people are in,
Yes.
not only like in those situations, but within organizations. Like, you feel like there is a bit of power over you, and the to be
Yeah.
able to feel comfortable to say this is not right, this is not good for me, you're doing the wrong thing, right, is really hard,
Yeah.
especially, there I was staying overnight in their space, and I wanted to be safe overnight, so I felt like I needed to say the right things at work, and in places that I've worked at.
Yep.
I felt that it's connected to my pay, it's connected to my career, and um, I shouldn't say certain things, and I would rather leave the organization on good standing and try and figure
Mm,
out something else than to call them out on that. And I think a lot of organizations don't realize what a gift it is if someone feels
yeah.
comfortable enough. If you've laid out a thing and you're like, we want to hear about these issues, and then someone feels comfortable enough to tell you, and then you're like,
Mhm.
why are you complaining about that, or that's not what they meant, or whatever they then
Yeah, thank you so
you're
much
going
for
to
sharing
lose any
some of your
credibility.
experiences too, because I feel like it is so important for people to understand that your lived experience is not the same as everyone else's lived experience. And it doesn't, just because you live a certain experience does not mean that that is the reality for everyone and that that's the truth of an industry or a space. And I think that this sheds so much light on, just the difference in how you have to approach going to an outdoor space or staying in a small town to go to an outdoor space, and all of the different checkpoints you have to think about before you even go and do something. But then also when you're out doing something, all of the different things that I'm sure go through your mind when you're outdoors in these spaces too, that are like checks and balances of like, am I safe? Do I feel okay? Am I comfortable? Like, what is this person going to say when they come past me? Or, I'm sure that your mind is always going.
Calculations yeah, I think it is a part of the calculations that folks do, and it's sad, and I mean it's not um
Yeah.
these are things that happen on so many different levels. Like they happen to
Yep.
women, they happen to people that are open about their sexuality, like in all of these different spaces. And we have to have that conversation about how do we create those spaces that are welcoming, and with an understanding that different identities can have those different
Yeah.
experiences, and we need to respect that and honor that and
Yeah.
say,
So that
okay,
was
well,
actually
let's hear
another
from you, and
question
what
that
what
one
can
of
we do.
my teammates yesterday wanted to ask was, what are the suggestions that you may have for how people who may not understand fully or just getting started or like want to be a better ally, how can they help and be more supportive to different communities, people who are saying like, this is my sexual identity, I want to feel safe outdoors, or I am a fat woman or a fat man that wants to get outdoors, I want to feel comfortable in these spaces, or I'm from a different community, I want to feel safe in these spaces. Like, how can we be more supportive and show up in community?
Yeah. I think that when we can support organizations and groups that are trying to help people make that introduction to those spaces. And sometimes the first introduction that people might have is in affinity groups, in spaces with people who um, are like them, right? So um, I would say we can support those programs. We can also create programs within our organizations that allow people to come in and not be the only one, right? But to have those different affinity groups or safe spaces, or whatever. I think if we're within organizations, we can think about the way that we perceive diversity, inclusion, and equity within our organizations. Oftentimes, we
Yeah.
think of the melting pot analogy that we have as a country,
Yeah.
right? Everybody comes together, we melt them down. The one delicious stew called America. I think
Hmm.
that we think about that in our organizations too, right? Like people come in, we need you to melt down to our organizational culture, right? And I know I felt that
Mm,
pressure when I started with environmental education. I was like, I better get a fleece. I better stop wearing these head wraps. I better change. Like, I felt like I needed to change a lot of things to fit in. And instead of thinking of our communities and our organizations as a melting pot, I encourage people to think of it more like a salad bowl.
yeah,
And in a salad bowl, everything kind of maintains its integrity. Like, you want your lettuce to be crisp and crunchy, and your onions to be tart and tangy, and your
yeah,
craisins to be sweet and plump, and all of those flavors work together, and they didn't have to lose what it was, right, to work together to create something that's really delicious. And so how can we do that within our organizations and within our community, and have an understanding that differences are okay, and we don't have to necessarily understand everything about a person's life experience to have empathy and to care and to understand that they should have
yeah,
basic human rights and should be treated well, right? Like, you don't have to know exactly what it's like
yes.
to be
Yeah,
them
and
in
I
order
love
to
that you brought
fight
up,
for
getting
those
involved with
other
more
things.
organizations and just, giving space, like learning from each other and uplifting one another. And I wanted to take a little bit more time too to talk about like ableism and able bodies versus disability. And because I feel like that is a huge part of the DEI conversation, but it isn't talked about as much in mainstream conversations about DEI. I feel like it gets overlooked a little bit. But do you have any organizations that you have worked with or that you are connected with around disability awareness and community in that space? Because one of our team members would love to be able to connect more in that capacity. And I feel like anybody listening that might, have someone that they love or they themselves love to be outdoors, but they are disabled or have a loved one that is in a disability group, do you have any suggestions for communities that they could connect with or organizations that they could get involved with?
Yeah, there is disabled hikers, and there's a lot of groups around like
Mhm.
disability in the outdoor spaces. So that's definitely out there. And Siren is just they're amazing, leading the disabled hikers group. There's also, folks have heard of No Barriers, and
Mm.
Eric, who is the leader of No Barriers, he's a blind adventurer, and does programming and creates opportunities for people to get into outdoor spaces, right?
That's perfect. Yeah, thank you so
Yeah,
much because I
without
feel like you
barriers
are
to getting
so
into those spaces.
involved and ingrained in the communities of just uplifting everybody. So I figured you would be a good person to ask for some more resources for our team. And the one other question that one of our teammates had was when you're shopping for gear that you like to get outdoors in, she was saying like it's really hard as a bigger bodied woman to find companies that are offering extended sizing, and she wanted to know if you have brands that you feel like are ethical and sustainable and size inclusive that you really like.
I'm still
Yeah.
developing. I would have to be honest and say I'm still developing that myself. And like, a lot of my gear it's not necessarily from outdoor brands. There are outdoor brands that are really trying to kind of be size inclusive. Though even as they do that, they typically end at like sizes 26 or 28. And so they don't go
Yeah.
up to like the sizes that a lot of people need who are in fat plus size community.
Mm, mm.
um, but they're very proud of that. They're like, we have a size 24. And so, or sometimes those sizes are, it's interesting, it's a push and pull. Like, I'll get things like and you'll spend like
Mm,
$200 on a pair of pants, but they're like a balloon around because of the way like their
yeah.
sizing isn't made for like maybe people who have certain curves or whatever. So often find myself like repurposing uh, tights and workout pants and like other clothing from brands that aren't uh, traditionally outdoor brands, but are more
Yeah,
size
I feel like
inclusive
I've already
to
taken
get what
more
I
time
need
than I
for
asked
being
from you. So I'm
outside.
trying not to take up too much time. But I'm like, this could be a whole nother episode just talking about, the inclusivity with clothes and apparel and different struggles for outdoor
Yeah.
experiences. So I'll have to just have you on again to talk about more things. But I did want to highlight that like this is the reality of just,
Okay.
everybody wanting to get outdoors, and there isn't the options aren't there. Like it's a struggle. And she gives us great feedback too about the clothes we're trying to make, and the sizes, and feedback on what we need to be doing better and where we're trying to go with things too. And her experience is trying to find outdoor gear and apparel and things to move in that feel good, that fit well, that aren't just like being thrown together like, well, we need the sizes, so we're just going to do it. So yeah, and that like not fitting bodies well. So thank
Yeah.
you for shedding light on that too, because I think it's important, and we'll be on a part two of this conversation. But I won't take up more of your time because it's too much time. So I have two
Yeah.
questions to wrap
That
things
sounds
up for
great.
you today. Where can people find you online? And then what does keeping nature wild mean to you?
Yeah. So folks can find me, at queenwork.com or ecoinclusive.org and on my social media platforms. Um, and
Yes.
the question was, what does keeping nature wild mean to me? It takes me back to like the conservation ethic and this idea about nature as being separate
Yeah.
from people that we see in like writers like John Muir. And I don't think that we are actually as people separate
Yeah.
from nature, right? I think that we are a part of it, but we often think about keeping nature wild as keeping people or certain people out of natural spaces and natural places. And so I think when I think about keeping nature wild, right, I think there is an element of um, not even necessarily like,
Yeah.
I think it's important all the ways that we need to protect nature, but I think there it is also about how, as humans,
Mm,
do we reclaim our natural state?
mm,
Because our natural state is supposed to be in harmony with nature. Like we're not a separate being, we're a part of nature. And so keeping nature wild is like, how do we also like think about ourselves as animals, as wild beings that are in harmony with nature so that we can better serve nature and better protect nature and understand the ways that we are living a part of it,
mm.
apart from it, because we're not wild, we're not connected,
I love that.
right? So I don't know if that's like rewilding ourselves or like
Okay, you said you were going to
coming into
ramble. That was
harmony,
beautiful.
coming
So
into harmony with
that was,
nature.
yeah, that was so wonderful. I agree. I feel like the
Okay.
term rewilding ourselves is really well phrased there, that if we come back to understanding that we are part of that cycle instead of separate from the cycle, we would all have a heart for nature more. And I think then that would also lead for us having hearts for each other more. And it's all a cycle of like, oh, if I'm in tune with what's happening in my surroundings, my environment, then maybe I'll have more in tuneness with each other as well. And yeah, so that was beautifully said. But Parker,
Yeah.
thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I feel like we just scratched the surface. I still have a list of questions that we didn't even get to because I don't want to steal all of your time. But thank you so much for sharing space with me and having this conversation. And I can't wait for everybody to listen to this. All of her links will be in the show notes. So you can go and find her on all of the medias and her amazing companies that she is doing and all of her initiatives. Please go give her a follow, support everything she's doing. Thank you so much for the time, and can't wait to schedule part 2 because this is just the beginning. But truly, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
All right. That
Thank
sounds
you.
wonderful.